All right. Let's talk about Chapter 9, language development. So, thinking about what I said in the previous chapters about how important cognitive development is, and within that, how important language is, we're going to take a much closer look in this chapter about why or how we develop language, because it is the pivotal point with regard to the ability to use symbolic thought. So we'll talk about development, we'll talk about primary, secondary languages, and then scattered individuality in language development, okay? Okay, so again, the question is, the essential question here is, are we born with a capacity to learn language? Or is it something that you obtain behaviorally, right, from the outside? That's what modeling and reinforcement is. So that children learn language by imitating others. And then the reward system that goes along with adult-like speech. So if you think about, which by the way is going to be your discussion question for this chapter, if you think about the way that children begin to speak and the program that the parents are on, there is a sense of anything that approximates adult language or well-spoken language is reinforced. Oh my gosh, you said mama, such a good thing. Say it again, mama, 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 or whatever it might be. And they get very excited about it. And what's interesting is the reason that parents get so excited about it is because up until that point, the thing that is true about relationships with children is that they are not terribly reciprocal. Until language comes into play, aside from the social smile, you don't get a whole lot back. There's the molding of the child, like physically molding to your body, and there is reaching for you. There's like these little nonverbal cues, but to be called by your title, mama, dada, is so reinforcing of that attachment and that relationship. My baby knows who I am. And that is sort of a definitive proof that the baby knows who you are, is when they start to discriminate you as an object and then call you by your title. And so we get super excited about it. And that's why, by the way, it's a video that's easy to find on YouTube, is because everybody wants to put it online and show people because they're so excited. Some of the fun videos to look at online with regard to this are the ones where you're like, yeah, that wasn't really language. We do tend to try and find language where it's really probably babbling, but the fact that you catch that moment where the babble most closely approximates a word is what causes the parents to then sort of heavily reinforce, and then that increases the likelihood of that behavior reoccurring, right? So that's what that's all about. Nativism is also true, by the way. It's a mixture of all of these things. These are just different theories. It's not like one theory is right, one theory is wrong. Again, these theories are talking about explaining different aspects of a much more complex process. So there's that one piece called behavioral, mimicking, imitating, and reward. And then there's nativism, which is that we have a built-in capacity for developing language. It's part of our genetics to be able to develop language and to develop the language that we then see around us, right? Which is why technically any human being should be able to learn any language, like at a very young age. And why when people move to this country, the children tend to learn the language much faster, and they tend to lose their accents and all of that, is because they are more in the mode. When you're younger, there is a critical period for developing language, and you're still really good at it. The fact that we wait until almost middle school for kids to really take a serious approach to learning a different language is actually starting quite late in terms of when is the best time cognitively to learn a new language. The cognitive processing part of this obviously integrates everything we talked about in the previous two chapters with regard to your ability to remember how things were said, what was said, and not just cognitive, like symbolic memory, but think about the muscle memory, right? When the next time you're in a conversation with someone or you're talking to yourself or whatever, think about all the muscle memory that goes into how you form each of those sounds, right? That's what speech therapy is all about, is understanding how our musculature and our throat and our muscles all connect with our brain and our capacity for long-term memory to produce speech. And then also the attention piece of it is really about attending to, like having a conversation, attending to what's said, reasoning through a conversational sort of language, like being able to have a sense of what needs to be said, which is why it's so frustrating when people have things like aphasia, which is brain damage that causes you to not be able to create the word your brain wants to create. It creates sort of nonsense words, or not nonsense words. You can create actual words, just not the words you're looking for. As an example, so my mother has dementia, and she has this problem sometimes of finding the word that she wants. And she was looking at some strawberries, and she said instead, "The frogs got my onion," which of course made us all laugh, because, when you're dealing with stuff like that, you have to laugh. And so from then on, strawberries sort of took on a different cultural meaning in our family, because of the phrase that was used in replace of that. She was really trying to say strawberries. She knew they were strawberries. She just couldn't get the word strawberry from her long-term memory into working memory and properly out, because of the difficulty with where the brain was impacting from dementia. Okay. Sociocultural is all about the social interaction with people. Language does not develop in a vacuum. That's all that means, right? Like it develops in relationships. And then functionalism is the practical benefits. When kids are being what we call, quote, lazy, and they sort of aren't wanting to speak, and so instead of asking for what they want, they go and point. One of the things that the parents do is they sort of frustrate that child. If you want to reach your goal of having that cookie, then I'm going to need you to say cookie or want or whatever, word it is that you decide to put into that behavior. And then the reinforcement of that, right? We go back up to the modeling and reinforcement. The reinforcement of that is getting what you want. And so I often say that even to children. I say, I don't know what you mean. I cannot help you when you say you are bored. I cannot help you when you just are screaming and crying. I need words. I need words to understand your anger. I need words to understand your feelings. I need words so that we can problem solve. So there's that also, that very functional, practical aspect of language. All right, so I kind of feel like I went over this enough. You can take a look at it in your book, and I've added sort of my pieces to it. And again, I'll write it down. So your first discussion question for this will be around looking at videos that parents post of their children saying their first words. This primary piece, let me talk about this last piece. Current research suggests that this is not a primary mechanism for native language learning, meaning that there is a lot of kind of inborn stuff that happens that allows you to develop your native language being your first language, right? Children have a basic universal grammar. What they mean by that is the flow of language, that we seem to have a uniquely designed brains, right? Like our brains are uniquely designed to process that. We have a language center in our brain. We are born with the capacity and the readiness to process and create grammatical structure. And to communicate. It's something that's in our genetics, and then it's in the structures of our brain when we're born, and you get sort of ready to do that. So that sensitive, second to last one on the bottom there, sensitive periods, that's what I was talking about. Really, children need to have proper exposure when they're very young to the encouragement to learn language. And then I talked about the brain regions. Working memory, attention, reason, we've covered that already. Paying attention to the ends of words, a new word must label a new object. That's kind of, put a little star next to that. Because as a teacher, I think that's kind of important. If you're going to teach very young children, the thing that you're often doing, not even very young children, anyone really in elementary school, or even in high school, when you think about how complex things get, we're talking about here about vocabulary. Okay, so think about how we teach vocabulary. When you get beyond the knowledge of how to use words, we are forever in our lifetime learning new words, right? And then sometimes we even like to play with our language. I heard today, so like social distancing, that's a new vocabulary word for people. We know all the pieces and parts of it, but we start to put them together in creative ways. Someone posted something earlier today that was about somebody who, I don't know, it was a meme of some kind, and it was like, I don't know, a woman had made some kind of a martini or whatever, and they were calling them like quarantinis, and then they said, this is my quarant queen. Like, we like to smush words and play with our language, and so we have these ways of manipulating language. And so even kids in elementary school, when you're teaching language, you're introducing them to so many new words that are labels, and in the label of a new object, it may be an object in time and space, or then the new word may reflect a thought process or a concept, right? Not just a new object, but like the word perspective. Think about the fact that you have to learn what that word means. The word theoretical, the word perspective, the word basic, all of these are sort of these more advanced words that kids start to have their language explosion, right? And a lot of that, I think, comes from the kind of language that's used around them. And I'm not a big fan of baby talk, and I'm not. I think kids develop the language that they hear. But we often have to be sometimes kids learn like swear words. Talk about swear words for a minute. Kids will learn swear words, and what's fascinating to most parents is when they use them in context. Right? And, maybe that would be a good one. Maybe I'll give you an option in the discussion questions about either finding one where it's like baby's first words, or finding one where a kid has used a swear word like really appropriately. Not that, there's a couple of them where they make the kids say it, but the ones that are funny are the spontaneous ones. Because they don't really understand that it's a bad word. They just know the reaction that they get from people, right? When they say the bad word or when they say the word, the parents tend to laugh, they're paying attention, but they've heard the word in context. And what is so fascinating to people endlessly is that little kids learn not just the word, but the context in which to use the word, right? I'll think about that. I don't know. Okay, and then cultural customs obviously influence mental processes. How people talk to kids, when people talk to kids, what kind of language people use to talk to kids, whether or not kids are around adults a lot, or if they don't have a lot of adult interaction and they're mostly interacting with younger people. All of these things will have an impact on the process of language development and what that looks like. So the more resources, the more well-rounded. Okay. So instructions, we're always correcting, right? So what's that thing that we do when kids say a word and they mispronounce it? We usually know what they mean, right? They usually don't mispronounce it to the point we don't understand what it means, but you will see people just very reflexively correcting the pronunciation of that word and sort of fixing it and molding it and putting it where it belongs. And then it really can bother, for the grammar police. It's not just the written word, but when people mispronounce spoken words, it can be a huge pet peeve. I imagine all of you have some word that it either drives you either say it wrong and you say it wrong, but you can't seem to change it, or there's a word, like I knew somebody once who instead of saying ambulance, they said ambience. And it used to drive me crazy to have any conversation where that word would be used, because you don't want to correct an adult, but our our inner desire for appropriate communication between humans wants you to say, I'm sorry, what did you say? No. It's ambulance. Like, look at the way it's spelled. But when somebody learns something like that, it usually, if you look at the family, the whole family says it that way. And then, of course, functionalism, the why of it, right? To get practical benefits, and to share those experiences, get help, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so these are just definitions. And probably the second thing that I'll ask you to do is to get some, just to come up with some examples of these sorts of things. Like a semantic development is about developing the understanding of word meaning. Syntactic is about how you combine words and what the rules are for the language you're learning. The ability to listen and the ability to speak. So there is two things. There's receptive language and then there's expressive language. And you can have a child who has autism, let's say, and has very little expressive language, but has a great deal of receptive language. Now take that back to the chapter on intelligence. And that's where it integrates with regard to how we test somebody's IQ if they have some kind of, even people with aphasia sometimes can understand what they're being told, but they can't find the right word, right, to get it out. And so kids with disabilities can be the same. Just because they're not speaking does not mean they're not listening, and does not mean that they're not processing and understanding the meaning of words. It just means that they can't produce necessarily the language, okay? Pragmatics, using language to communicate effectively. It's important for people to know what you mean. This is why, so kids who, there are two, I wonder if we're going to get into it here, but kids who stutter, I might be getting ahead of myself, but it's okay. It's because in my head right now. Kids who stutter and kids who have some, like roll some of their letters, they, like, it's hard because there are some 2-year-olds, their parents can understand them because they've heard the words used repeatedly, but they still need speech therapy because they're really not communicating effectively because they're garbling some of their letters. And so their pronunciation isn't strict enough to the norm of pronunciation in order to get their point across, right? Does that make sense? So then we have speech therapy to help them sort of conform to the linguistic norm. And then stuttering, we have to be super careful because in stuttering, it does not help to finish people's sentences. But because we have an expectation of the flow of the way a sentence is supposed to go, when someone gets stuck and they start to our heads have already finished the word that they're going to say, and it can be very frustrating to our brains to not finish that sentence for that child. It has nothing to do with, feeling bad because they're struggling. Your brain wants that sentence finished, wants that word finished, because it disrupts the flow of what we expect with regard to the flow of communication and language and words and speaking. So we have to be super patient and take deep breaths and really allow a child who has, some speech, because usually the speech therapist has given them some kind of tools to work on when they're speaking to correct their stutter. But when they first do that in elementary school, it takes time for them to implement the breathing and the different exercises that the speech therapist will be having them do, when they encounter a moment of stuttering. So we have to make sure we give them plenty of time to answer. Okay, and then of course knowledge about language. Everything is meta, right? There's always a meta level of understanding the purpose of language, and that's when we understand metalinguistic. When we have that, that's when we can start to play with our language and create new words and abbreviations and all of that kind of stuff. All right, so there we go. Receptive language. Look at that, as early as 8 months of age. So you have a child who's understanding word meanings at about 8 months of age, but the production of first words lags by, 3 months or so, right? Maybe 4, depending on when the first words come out. By 16 to 18 months, there's 50 words, and then blam, all of a sudden they're a talker. And you have a kid who's giving you like 3-word sentences. It's kind of an amazing thing to watch. So, I mean, this is just practical. Think about this as practical. Label for concrete objects obviously come before abstract. Lexical words precede grammatical words, so all those sort of filler-ins. That's why we start with, which is why we start, with like a one word and then two words, and then sort of the completion pieces of a sentence, right? Like an entire sentence. That all comes in sometimes it's just pointing and a noun, pointing and a noun. And then you get want cookie, right? Instead of the pointing gets replaced by the word want. So you get these little kinds of things that go on, through repetition. And then pronunciation under an overextension. Okay, so how do you foster this kind of development? Talking regularly to, with, and around infants and young children, but not, and like engaging them in conversation. I love watching preschoolers in conversation with each other. And I love watching toddlers in conversation with each other. I mean, that's another whole set of videos, right? Or all those videos of parents talking to their kids and the kids don't have language yet, but they're intonating up and down with the parent and mimicking. We love that stuff, right? And that comes first. And so the more you do that, the more you talk with a child, and I would really circle that word with, the more likely, that child is going to develop a really strong use of language. Invite children to listen and to read. Reading and language, they go together eventually. But listening and reading to children and seeing the pages and the pictures and all of that stuff, and putting the fact together that the pictures go with the story that's being told, all of that is pre-reading, all of that develops their language. I mean, here's, your basic spelling test, right? You have certain words for each week. The reason you have that is because you're teaching them to expand the vocabulary, and you're exposing them to new words. And so the thing you do, what do you have them do, right? You have them practice the definition of that word. So the word, the definition of that word, and then using that word in a sentence. Okay. Provide examples, and then give feedback when children use words incorrectly, which is obviously something that I think people instinctively do. That's what I was talking about before. And then syntax. So infants are aware of patterns in speech. I already said that. We've seen people do that. That's what's happening. The syntax of playing with ups and downs and different types of speech. So ran and runned, those kinds of little mistakes. That's sort of they create rules, but their rules are concrete, and then you have to teach the exceptions, which makes, by the way, English not an easy language to learn. Of a lot of the languages, we have so many exceptions, not just in our in the way we write a word, but in the way we modify our words, right? So sometimes past tense is an ed, and other times it's a completely different word. So run and ran versus run and runned, right? You have to teach those. You have to teach all of those exceptions, and boy, that is the work of definitely the work of early elementary school. So development progresses obviously through secondary levels, meaning it always grows. Your vocabulary is always is always growing, and so you start with getting more and more complex, and then more and more flowery. One of the things that always amazed me working in Trinidad, their students, man, gosh, could they speak eloquently? Like, there's just something different about the sophistication with which they expect their children to speak, the language, the floweriness. And then even in fourth grade, they are already teaching like novelesque writing. I don't even know what I would call that. Like their assignment is to write a sentence and be able to use 3 or 4 adjectives to describe an experience. So the night was stormy and blustery and the wind was blowing. Like, they actually teach that in fourth grade. And that's how they're expected to be able to write, with these sort of expounding phrases. I was so impressed because they were doing it at such a young age. But anyway, so we start with hollow phrases, single words, and then grammatical words by the age of 3. So now you're really putting your sentences together and you're having like full conversations with a 3-year-old that are super cute. And then the more subtle rules we teach in school. And, this is where, by the way, this is where teachers can really struggle, because if you have students who are culturally, like, say, living in the inner city or are immigrating from a different country, they may come knowing English, but their intonation isn't going to be what's expected, right? Their use of the language, their use of certain ways of pronouncing words are going to be different. And so sometimes it can be difficult in school because you're trying to teach them something that's more globally standard with regard to the English language. And it can be hard. It can be hard for them. So have some patience with those kids. Yeah. So I think that's pretty self-explanatory, right? Children pay attention to word order, word combinations, and word meanings when interpreting and producing sentences, but that takes a long time to learn. I mean, a surprisingly short time in the whole lifespan, but it takes years, really, of several of the first few years learning how to manage all of that piece of it. And so you're talking like questions. Children can get confused by complicated sentences. Children can get confused by complicated words, and which is why I kind of break things down. Remember when I said things like in your classroom, have a rule where you just are supposed to be safe. And that way, any behavior you can say, oh, you're not being safe right now, because you want to use as simple a sentence as possible when you really need them to get your point right away. If you ramble on to a small child, they get confused. It's too complicated. The word is too big. They don't know what it means. And even sometimes, like with 12 and 13-year-olds, I will find myself using words in therapy with them, and I'm always a little bit surprised that they don't know what those words mean. It's strange to me. Okay, it is largely a constructive and unconscious process. So what does that mean? It means that it isn't something, in cases where there's a difficulty, we have to be super intentional about teaching certain things. And we are intentional about teaching certain things like spelling and grammar and things of that nature. But a lot of it is done in a what quote automatic kind of way. We have an entire portion of our brain that is just there to manage language. And so a lot of it can be done through like vicarious learning, like just the process of listening creates these schemas in the brain for how language goes. And that's why a lot of people who are trying to learn a second language that are struggling like to do immersion, right? Because when you are in a country that speaks, say, Spanish, and you go there and you immerse yourself in it and you speak no English whatsoever, your brain is forced to adapt, and it does all kinds of things without you needing to intentionally do it to start processing on a more complex level the rules of that language. All right, so expand on telegraphic speech, meaning help children, when they're giving you a few words, help them expand what they want to say, right? By giving them an example of the entire sentence. Teaching irregular verbs and comparative adjectives. This is the stuff that has to be done intentionally. Describing various sentence structures, giving children practice, repetition, get things into long-term memory, get things integrated on a verbal level. The nice thing about the language is that language is used in absolutely every moment of every day of everybody's life, especially school children. So it doesn't matter. If you're teaching science, they're learning language. If you're teaching math, they're learning language. That's why literacy is such a huge deal. If you really want to specialize in something that makes a huge difference, get a certificate in literacy, because it is, it's just such a vital piece of being a functioning human. And a lot of kids need a lot of extra help. So again, expressing their ideas in a relatively formal way and give feedback about appropriate syntax. So what you want is really, this is just, it's not just the relationship, but talk to kids, have conversations with them, ask them what they're thinking. We talked about cognitive development and the capacity to develop, your thought process and your problem solving, it's also developing language, because they have to find the words to express to you what it is they're trying to communicate and what their own little self theories are. Right? So you're tackling multiple things at a time when you're teaching language, or when you are having just a general conversation over lunch with your students, and you're engaging them and asking them challenging questions and really listening with interest to what they have to say. All right. Infants focus on native language sounds. Those are the things they hear on a regular basis. They rely heavily on the context. Remember, I told you they learn swear words really fast that way. So this, I want to focus on this. Elementary school children do not always know what to do when they don't understand, meaning that you have to teach kids to ask questions. You have to teach kids to talk to you, and seek out more information when they are when they have something that they didn't understand. It is amazing to me as a therapist. I am often confronted, like I said, I'll use words, and it very rarely do kids say, I didn't understand. You just smile and nod, right? And they pretend they understood, and they try to get it in context or the general idea without really understanding the word, but there's a look that comes over their faces. So you have to look for that look. It's sort of this weird, sort of crinkly, between the brow, confused look. And you can say to a child, do you know what that means? Or, just expand on it and say, well, what I meant was, and then try to use simpler language to give a definition of the word you just used that they didn't, quite understand. Yeah, so there's a lot of intentional speaking when it comes to kids. And here's the fun part. As teachers, you will spend so much time with children that when you go home, you will end up talking to adults this way, and they don't always like it. So you have to be careful, because you'll spend a lot of time being very intentional, and you don't want to come home and talk to adults like you're a kindergarten teacher. It feels demeaning to adults when you talk to them that way. That is a little tidbit of wisdom from lots of experience of people saying, what am I, 12? When I accidentally say things about the fact that they're having a big feeling about something. All right. Take into account children's development when speaking to them, meaning making sure your language is at their level. Also think about the amount of attention and their attention span. The longer you talk to them, the less they're going to miss out on things. So they need to build that as a skill. Check in frequently to make sure they understand. It's another thing that will develop because you're a teacher. Little therapist story. So as a therapist, I'm often checking in to see if I've been understood, right? So somebody says something, I say, well, I wonder if it means this. But you'll notice if you pay attention, your brain processes it. But until it's brought to your attention, it's not something that you would necessarily notice. Is that at the end of sentences, I tend to end them with a like an up. I end them on an up, almost as if I'm asking a question, because I might end something and say with an up, because I am asking a question, right? See, I just did it. Did you hear it? When I said right, like as a question, that is one of the ways that I have developed in my unconscious processing of language to check in with my students or to check in with my patients to see if they understand me. And I never had any idea that I had developed this particular way of ending a sentence until I went to testify in court. And two different places. One, I went to testify in court, and the lawyer was like, do you have an opinion? And I said, yes. And they said, well, then don't end your sentences with a question, right? Like, don't check in to see if people are understanding you. You're being declarative. And I had to consciously train my brain to speak in a declarative way so that I didn't go at the end. That did not last long, because even when I was in consulting, we did a public speaking seminar. And the trainer, I have a lot of public speaking experience. And so I thought, I'm going to breeze through this training, no problem. And the trainer just got on me because when I was doing my public speaking, I would do that right at the end of sentences, and it was driving them crazy. So I spent hours trying to get that out of, but I still have to consciously not do it. And you will develop this as well, because it comes from working with kids, and it comes from this constant checking in to see if they understand the language that you've used. Adjust the length of verbal presentation to the attention span of the age group. I hope that just comes naturally to you. But I've told you before, I think I told you in class, when I've ended class, like there will be a time when you're a teacher where you'll be able to look out into a group of students and know when you've lost them. Like you've lost them. You've said too many words, they've processed too many words, and they're done. And then encourage critical listening, which means you're not just doing reading comprehension, right? You're doing listening comprehension. So you want to be able to tell a story and then ask them questions about that story so that you know that they are processing your verbal words and putting together the meaning and then able to pick out kind of what might happen next and things of that nature. Okay, so it goes in this order. Cooing, 1 to 2 months. Babbling, 6 months. Gestures, 12 months. Difficult consonants like R, this is what I'm talking about, kids who roll their language, where you might be kind of correcting them, 6 years. Phonemes and blends for English, 8 years. And then sentences and then longer discussions. Okay, so it takes a long time to get language really to be sort of adult level sophisticated. Oh, maybe that'll be a good one too, though. Okay. So this, I feel like this is kind of common sense if you really understand that we go from simple to complex, right? So conversations increase in length and depth. Yeah. Children will adapt the speech to the listener. That's the social stuff I told you about, culture and subgroups. Children become more skillful at narratives. I love listening to kids tell stories where they're like, and then, and they get kind of stuck in a weird pattern. It's because they haven't quite figured out how to get their thoughts smoothly into a story. And then the thing comes, and they often assume that like there are times where I have to tell kids, so I wasn't there watching that movie with you. Because they'll be like, well, they know in the movie where the guy does that thing and, whatever, and they have a hard time sort of getting sophisticated and it doesn't quite get the message across. I'll be like, you know what, I haven't seen that. You'll have to be more specific. But I always give them a chance to do it because it develops their capacity to tell their own narrative, which in the end, from an emotional standpoint, will actually help them to process their own emotions. Okay? So let them tell stories. Ugh, love it. Let them tell stories. Let them be creative. And if they're not writing yet, then listen to their verbal stories. Again, preschoolers, first graders at the lunch table are hilarious. And then, of course, you go more creative, more figurative expressions, and then you get to adolescence, which is so fascinating because by the time you get to like 5th or 6th grade, and then it blooms in middle school and adolescence, you have usually a generation that creates their own language. That's, the use of, there are certain things like I am simply too old to use certain words. I will never sound okay saying something even now, which is archaic, which would be like YOLO or, for my generation, everybody was just called dude. I don't know what it would be now. But you can tell that there are certain words that adults, if they use them, you're like, oh my God, please stop trying to be, a teenager. It just doesn't work. And sometimes you can kind of even tease and play. It's an interesting teasing and playing between teenagers and adults with regard to their understanding and use of language. Yeah. And how they use that to create their identity as a generation even. Okay. So regularly engage infants in conversation like they do on the YouTube videos. Let children know if their message is difficult to understand. So there is a trick here that I'm going to share with you. Write this one down and keep it with you somewhere because you are going to have a child in your class who has speech difficulties. And you're going to feel so bad when you have to say, what, right? Because they have to repeat themselves numerous times because their language is not understandable. So I have developed this way of doing this to try to preserve the child's self-esteem and decrease their frustration. And it takes a little bit longer, but what I say is, I'm really sorry. I didn't understand you the first time. So I'm going to ask you to say it one more time. And I will go through that whole sentence so that I'm not just saying what, because I don't know, it just screws up the message somehow and it gets them more frustrated. They're less frustrated when I say, I'm so sorry I didn't get all of that. Can you repeat it for me, please? Is just a kinder way to do that. And then, of course, again, encourage them to recall events and tell stories, what happened next, that kind of stuff, which is what those videos are doing when online. And then encourage creativity in oral language, using their words creatively to tell a story. Children learn and practice conversational rules. Yes, rules are very cultural specific. And then there's also when to be quiet, when to ask questions, or when to interrupt. Learning to say excuse me. That's a word, right? That's a phrase that kids like. Instead, no, you don't just interrupt adults when they're having a conversation. You say excuse me when you want to have a conversation with somebody. That's a whole piece of the pragmatics of our language in English, right? And then not just in English, but maybe just in the United States. How to interact with adults versus peers, whether to make eye contact or not, all of these different social rules with regard to the pragmatics of having a conversation and communicating effectively with someone. The classroom will have language rules, playground rules versus home and family rules. That's what I was talking about, the different ways that you're expected to speak and engage in conversation with people. Awareness of components and purpose of language. Late preschool to early school age, it's not necessarily, how do I say this? It's not a conscious thing. It's not like you have a conversation with them about the purpose of language. It is an automatic understanding. And that understanding gets translated. The understanding is only clear to you through their appropriate use of the language. I hope that makes sense, right? You know that they understand the purpose of language because of the way they're using their language, not because you can talk about the purpose of language. Yeah? It's not like you're having theoretical conversations about it. There's just a knowingness that is underneath the way they're using language. And then middle childhood, obviously, we're talking about grammar class, labeling parts of speech and understanding language like that. And then understanding what the difference is between an adjective and an adverb and all that. Interpreting multiple meanings. So we often go through that. We're talking about different words, especially in the English language. We have a lot of words that mean a lot of different things and a lot of words that are pronounced the same way, but then when they're written differently. Two different ways to spell the word, Sean. We do a lot of that in English that can be very frustrating for other people. Jokes and riddles help kids to explore words with multiple meanings, or put nonsense things together. And if you understand what things are nonsense, you can better understand unconsciously what things are conform to the norm. Read literature that plays on the nature of language, and encourage learning a second language. So that's why, we try to, and we should start pretty young if we want their brains to be sort of as plastic, as elastic as they can be for language development at a young age. So yeah, English as a second language, ELL or ESL. Kids are kids who come to the United States usually, and they come to school and they are not as proficient in the English language, and so they need a little bit of extra help. But they do tend to pick it up really quickly, and from watching things like TV and YouTube videos and stuff like that. All right, so the advantages, obviously, of developing more than one language. Cultural and family connections and identity. So if you learn the language of your heritage, even though maybe you are third generation American born, you may want to learn Spanish because your family was originally from Spain or, anywhere in Latin America. They tend to score higher on tests of advanced cognitive functioning, intelligence, and creativity. So this is the piece, circle, underline, because you'll hear this. People have different opinions about it, that there's an initial, like people who are raised in two language households right from the go have an initial short-lived delay in language development because they're switching in between. And you may end up with like partial mastery of the second language, the one that you're not using as much. And kids who are learning a second language, anytime you're learning a second language, that's the immersion piece of it. If you don't have a lot of places to practice it, then it's much harder to learn that second language. But I always love, like, teenagers. I have kids that are bilingual, they come from any other country, right? So they came from, let's say, Mexico, and until they were 6, they were speaking only Spanish. And then they get to the United States and they learn English. By the time they're 12, their ability to switch seamlessly between languages. I've had kids speak to me in Spanish and then turn and just speak to me in English, and then just turn and start speaking to their parents in Spanish, even when their parents can speak English, because that's what they speak at home. And it's this beautiful, seamless thing. I get super jealous. I wish I had done something like that. I'm not going to test you on this portion of it, because unless you're really unless you're going into like a bilingual education experience. So a lot of Hebrew schools do this. A lot of the Hebrew schools will have half the day will be in English, and half the day all of their regular classes are taught in Hebrew. So there's that. Just know that those things exist. And then submersion. Just being around it, that's the television piece of it. Immersion, which is speaking only in the language you're trying to learn, like being immersed in it. So they receive instruction in language arts in their first language and instruction in a second language in other subjects, right? So science is taught in the other language or whatever. And then traditional, obviously, we know this. Everybody has had to do it. It's required, right? At some point, either in high school or college, you've had to have some sort of second language and some sort of amount of that language. And it doesn't usually get us, if you're only have to required to do 2 years of it, most people don't end up going anywhere near being fluent in that piece of it. Let's see. Gender stuff. Girls are more verbally active than boys. But again, see where it says small difference? That's why I kind of want you to ignore these things. I mean, I guess, okay, there's information, there it is. But boys are taught to be more direct, girls more polite, but the differences are so small that I don't want it to create any kind of biases in the way that you interact with your students. So that's why I hesitate when we talk about these kinds of differences at the end of each chapter. Larger vocabularies in kids with higher income homes is because they're exposed to more stuff. That's all. It's resources. And then the ethnicity, the social linguistic behaviors. By the way, if you guys, I don't know how you guys have been experiencing listening to these tapes, but I notice every time I say the word and there are a lot of public speaking gurus that will work really hard with you on getting rid of your ums and filler language that we use and it's really to keep pace is why we use it. It's while we're thinking. Our brain, instead of just pausing and having silence in order to process what you're going to say next when you're speaking off the cuff, when you're thinking, you just automatically throw in these filler words of it's a space. It creates a space and gives your brain a chance to keep up with to get your thought process out of your mouth, but without dropping down into silence, which would end the sentence. I think that makes sense, right? All right, exceptionalities in language development, specific language impairments, difficulty in one or more area of language, language that's not age appropriate, so it's not developing in sophistication. It could be caused from reading and writing. It could be inherited. There could be issues with the brain or the way the brain processes language. I talked about aphasia and stuff like that. And it is, you get your speech language people involved. You get your literacy people involved. And there are so many different ways. Maybe that'll be the second one. I think that'll be your second discussion question for this chapter, is to look up specific language impairments and come up with one intervention for whatever you come up with. There's going to be hundreds of them to choose from. Sensory impairment, visual and auditory, so deaf kids, right? Kids who have hearing loss. Intervene as early as possible to address anything that might be correctable in terms of hearing, because if you can't hear, you can't learn how to do speech. Communicate messages through multiple modalities, so sign language, picture boards, reading, writing, that kind of stuff. I know some American Sign Language because I needed it when I worked as a case manager with developmentally disabled adults, and I just encourage teachers to use it and to learn it, and I encourage you to teach your kids it. I just think it's an interesting second language, and it is considered, by the way, a second language. Okay, so be on the lookout for children who exhibit significant delays or other language problems, unusual for their age group. You're going to find this. If you're teaching first grade, you're going to find all kinds of speech language stuff happening in first grade. And you might be the first one to really notice it because, like I said, their parents are listening to them every day, and they tend to understand things that may not be as understandable to other people. Encourage children to speak in your class. Remember I said be patient with kids who stutter and stuff like that. So be patient, listen carefully, ask for clarification when a message is unclear. But again, I'm sorry, I didn't understand that. Can you please repeat that? And then help them in ways that you can in the classroom in terms of giving them corrections to their language or how to communicate effectively with others. And then obviously following whatever speech language pathologists might say. So here are your take-home messages. So behavioral theories cannot explain why most children acquire complex language systems in a very short period of time with limited guidance, which is where the nativism comes in, right? And information processing and all of that kind of stuff. So I think you guys have that. Okay.